Hi folks, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial series covering our RJ Professional. In this video we will be covering the engine start and taxi procedures in the RJ. We will start this video just as passenger boarding and refueling has complete and the cabin crew has retracted the air stairs and closed the doors. On the main instrument panel we can confirm that there is sufficient brake accumulator pressure in the yellow system. If there isn't, we can temporarily switch on the DC pump on the overhead panel until sufficient pressure is indicated, before then ensuring that all switches on the hydraulic panel are off for engine start. Moving down to the ice protection panel, we can set the ice detect switch to on. On the lights panel we can arm the cabin emergency and no smoking switches before moving down the overhead and switching on the fasten seatbelt signs. On the centre panel, confirm that we have sufficient fuel for the flight. We are carrying 2,600 kilograms of fuel in each of the wing tanks today and 0 kilograms in the centre tank. We can now configure the TRP or thrust rating panel for takeoff. This is an unusual and interesting system that requires a little bit of study. The TRP is powered on and defaults to the Toga max setting on the ground. This is the maximum power the engines can provide at the current outside air temperature. If we wanted to perform a derated takeoff, we would push the Toga button once until redo, reduced, is illuminated. We can then rotate the outer control knob to the temp position and adjust the assumed temperature for the derate. The higher the temperature, the larger the derate. For today's flight we will be performing a reduced thrust departure with a temperature of 30 degrees. So we can set that now on the TRP. The TRP is also used to set the V-speed bugs on the PFD for takeoff and for landing. The V-speeds for our current weight are shown on the speeds flip chart adjacent to the TRP, and we now need to input them into the TRP itself. We'll cover the manual method for setting the V-speeds in the TRP in this tutorial flight, but the V-speeds can't be automatically set in the TRP by simply clicking on the respective flap setting on the speed flip chart. Based on our current weight and takeoff flap setting of 18 degrees, we can deduce that our V1 speed is 124 knots, that's equal to our VR speed of 124 knots, V2 is 131 knots and VFTO is 172 knots. We can rotate the outer control knob to the V1 position and then rotate the inner knob until the TRP display shows our V1 speed of 124 knots. Rotate the outer control knob to the V cross position and then rotate the inner knob until the TRP display shows our VR speed of 124 knots. This is our rotation speed. Rotate the outer control knob to the V dot position and then rotate the inner knob until the TRP display shows our VFTO speed of 172 knots. This is our final takeoff speed and the speed at which we will begin to retract the flaps. We can then set our V2 speed of 131 knots on the MCP. This is our climb out speed in the event of an engine failure. In normal operations we will climb out at a speed of V2 plus 10 knots. With our navigation instruments now all set for departure, we can now close the cockpit door either by clicking on the handle or, for a little quality of life addition, you can click on the mechanical linkage on the hinge side of the door. The cockpit door can be locked by momentarily moving the flight deck door switch on the aft centre console to lock. The not locked annunciator will extinguish when the door is locked. Returning to the overhead panel, we can switch on the beacon lights. We can set both pack switches as well as the APU air switch to off for engine start. We don't require a pushback tug for this flight, but if we did, this would be a good time to request it by clicking on the 3 arrowed icon at the top right corner of the EFB. On the ice protection panel, ensure that all 4 engine anti-ice switches are on. Then on the fuel panel, switch on all 4 fuel pumps. Moving over to the engine section of the overhead, confirm that the start power switch is set to the norm position, and then set the start master switch to on. We will start the engines in order of 4, 3, 2 and 1, so first rotate the start selector to engine 4. Move the engine start switch to the start position for 1 second and then release it. The engine ignition and starter operating annunciators will illuminate. As engine 4 begins to spool up, monitor the N1, AGT and N2 values on the PED. Once N2 reaches approximately 10%, advance the thrust lever from fuel off to fuel on. We can confirm fuel flow and that N1, AGT and N2 are all increasing. Once engine 4 is stabilised at idle thrust, rotate the start selector to the engine 3 position and repeat the process. Once engine 3 is started, we can then repeat the process again for engines 2 and 1. With all 4 engines started, rotate the start selector to off and set the start master switch to off. As we are not expecting any icing conditions on our flight today, we can now turn off the engine anti-ice. On the electrical panel, set generators 1 and 4 to on. The generators on engines 1 and 4 are now providing electrical power to the aircraft. Moving up the overhead panel, we can set the brake fan switch to auto. Switch on the engine 2 and engine 3 hydraulic pumps and monitor the pressure increase in both systems. Once 3000 psi has been confirmed in each system, we can set the AC pump to auto and the PTU to on to supplement hydraulic power in the event of a failure during takeoff. On the ice protection panel, switch on all 5 heater switches. If we were to have animals in the animal bay in the cargo hold, we must switch on the animal bay heat switch on the first officer's instrument panel. We can now switch the APU air switch back to the on position to supply air conditioning to the cabin during taxi and takeoff, and switch on both pack switches. We can remove the chocks and ensure all doors are closed. We can now rotate the transponder mode knob to the TA or A position. Using the flap lever on the pedestal, we can now set flaps 18 for takeoff and confirm extension using the flap position indicator on the main instrument panel. We can switch on the taxi lights and then slowly advance the thrust levers to get the aircraft moving. We can now begin the short taxi to runway 28 via taxiway Alpha and then holding point Alpha 1. As we taxi, we can ensure that all of our flight instruments are set for departure. On the MCP, we can ensure that our V2 speed of 131 knots is set, the runway heading of 273 is set, and an altitude of 26,000 feet is set. As we will be using the flight directors for departure, we will now switch on both flight director switches, starting with the captain's flight director and then the first officer's flight director. A master light will illuminate on the side of the pilot flying. With no autopilot mode selected, the autopilot will default to the takeoff track mode, and the flight director bars will indicate runway heading and a vertical climb at a speed of V2 plus 10 knots once the aircraft's speed is greater than 70 knots. We can confirm that the rudder and aileron trims are centered and the elevator trim is within the green band range. The correct takeoff trim for your current weights can be set automatically by clicking the center of gravity static mean code box on the AFB. On the pedestal, we can now press and hold the config check button. If the config horn is not audible, that means the aircraft is correctly configured for takeoff. We can then press the cabin call button on the overhead panel to inform the cabin crew of an imminent takeoff.
Cabin crew, please take your seats for takeoff.
We should receive verbal confirmation from the cabin crew once the cabin is secured.
Cabin is secured for departure.
As we enter the runway, we can switch on the landing and strobe lights. We can set the auto throttle to the arm position and confirm the white auto throttle legend is displayed at the top left corner of the PFD. We can perform a full and free movement check of the control surfaces and confirm that all master warning system captions are extinguished except for any appropriate green captions. We can then come to a stop as we line up with the runway centerline. And so concludes part 2 of our RJ Professional tutorial series. The aircraft is now in position on the runway ready for takeoff. In part 3, we'll be covering the most exhilarating and highest workload portion of the flight, takeoff and climb.